Welcome to Hauntales, where darkest stories come alive. I know many of you tune into these tales to drift off to sleep, so settle in, relax, and get comfortable. Whether you're lying in bed or curled up on the couch, let the whispers of these chilling encounters carry you away. Before we begin tonight's story, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling tales. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it? I love seeing how far our stories travel. For the best experience, use your headphones, close your eyes, and let every word sink deep into your mind. Now we begin our stories for tonight. My hands trembled on the paddle, and for a moment I felt an inexplicable urge to turn the boat around, to return to the cursed shore. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faint light, flickering in the distance, barely visible through the fog. I clung to it, focusing on the glow, using it as a lifeline. Rowing toward it was the only thing that kept me moving, kept me sane. The light grew brighter, more distinct, until I realized it was a lantern, hanging from the prow of a much larger vessel, a ship that loomed out of the mist like a ghostly apparition. Its hull was covered in barnacles and seaweed, the wood weathered and rotting, but it was real, solid, a beacon of hope in the endless gray. I guided the boat closer, my hands shaking as I reached out, grabbing onto the ship's side. As I climbed aboard, the whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment I allowed myself to believe that I was safe, that I'd escaped the island and its horrors. But as I looked around, I realized I was alone. The deck was empty, the ship abandoned. A chill ran through me as I took in my surroundings: the empty lifeboats, the tattered sails hanging limp in the still air, and the faint, rotten smell that permeated everything. I began to explore, my footsteps echoing against the wooden planks. The ship was old, far older than it had any right to be, as if it had been drifting through the fog for centuries. The cabins were filled with relics from another time: rusted tools, tattered maps, and logs written in a language I couldn't decipher. As I ventured deeper into the bowels of the ship, I felt the familiar prickling sensation return. I wasn't alone. Something was here, lurking in the shadows, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I quickened my pace, moving down a narrow corridor that led to the captain's quarters. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open, stepping into a room that felt frozen in time. The walls were lined with shelves of books, each one coated in a thick layer of dust. A large, ornate desk sat in the center, its surface covered in maps and notes, all bearing the same strange symbols I'd seen on the trees back on the island. And there, on the desk, was a journal. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding as I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, meticulous, and the entries chronicled the ship's journey, a voyage to the island, an expedition in search of some ancient relic rumored to hold great power. But as I read further, the tone shifted. The entries grew frantic, filled with mentions of the Watchers, of strange rituals and sacrifices meant to appease the island's curse. "We've awakened something we cannot control. They come at night, their eyes empty, their whispers endless. The crew has begun to change, their minds unraveling, lost to the island's influence. I fear it's too late. We are trapped, bound to this place for eternity, cursed to wander the mist." The final entry was scrawled hastily, the words barely legible. "The island won't let us leave. We are bound to it, each of us a watcher now, doomed to wait for the next soul who dares to venture into our domain." I dropped the journal, stumbling back as the realization hit me. The crew hadn't escaped the island, they had become part of it, bound to the island's curse, transformed into the hollow-eyed figures that haunted the shore. A creak echoed from behind me, and I turned, my heart hammering in my chest. The doorway was filled with shadowy figures, their eyes empty, glowing faintly in the dim light. They stared at me, silent, their faces blank and unfeeling. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room with a maddening chorus. "Join us, Carter. It's your turn." I backed away, my mind racing. desperately searching for a way out. But the figures moved closer, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their hands reaching out, grasping for me. With a strangled cry, I bolted from the room, fleeing down the corridor as the watchers followed, their whispers echoing off the walls, filling every corner of the ship. I ran, my footsteps pounding against the deck, but no matter how fast I moved, they were always there, just behind me, their empty eyes staring, unblinking. I reached the edge of the ship, the railing cold against my hands as I looked out into the mist. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast gray expanse with no sign of land. Desperate, I climbed over the railing, my hands clinging to the wood as I prepared to jump, to throw myself into the water and escape the watcher's grasp. But as I looked down, I saw them, the figures wading through the water, their hollow eyes fixed on me, waiting. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I was trapped, bound to the island and its curse, just as they had been. As the watchers closed in, their whispers filled my mind, drowning out all else, consuming me, until I was nothing more than another voice in the endless chorus, another soul bound to the island's dark embrace. The descent into darkness. My world blurred, slipping away into an endless void of whispers and hollow gazes. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my memories fragmented and surreal, as though I was floating through someone else's nightmares. Every time I tried to focus, to ground myself in reality, the voices pulled me back, deeper into the darkness. Carter, accept it, surrender. Their words echoed in my mind, compelling, persuasive. The hollow-eyed figures stood around me in a circle, their faces expressionless, yet I could feel their intent bearing down on me like a physical weight. The island wasn't just cursed, it was alive, a malevolent force that fed on fear and despair. It had brought me here, guided me into its depths, and now it was determined to claim me. I struggled, clawing at the darkness, trying to break free. Somewhere, faintly, I could hear the ocean waves crashing against the shore, a distant reminder of the world beyond this hellish limbo. I focused on that sound, letting it ground me, pulling me back from the edge. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness lifted. I was lying on the cold, damp sand, the taste of salt heavy on my tongue. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale, gray light over the island. The mist had receded slightly, revealing the twisted trees and jagged cliffs that bordered the shore. The watchers were gone, leaving only faint, wet footprints in the sand, which faded quickly as the tide rose. For a moment I lay there, exhausted and disoriented, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. But then, as I sat up and took in my surroundings, a sickening realization washed over me. The island had let me go for now, but I knew, deep down, that it was only a temporary reprieve. It was toying with me, drawing out my fear, savoring my desperation. I had to find a way off this cursed place before it decided to pull me back into the darkness. My heart pounded as I rose to my feet, my gaze scanning the horizon for any sign of escape. But there was nothing, no ships, no lights, no land, just the endless, gray expanse of the ocean. The second discovery. Determined not to waste any time, I made my way back toward the heart of the island. The forest loomed ahead, its twisted branches stretching like skeletal fingers into the sky. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the creak of branches in the breeze, the distant calls of unseen creatures. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the island itself was trying to slow me down, to trap me within its suffocating embrace. As I moved deeper into the forest, I stumbled upon a clearing I hadn't seen before. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and strange symbols carved into its surface. The symbols matched those I'd seen in the journal on the ship, an indecipherable language that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. It felt wrong, as though the altar were a wound in the earth, a scar left by whatever horrific rituals had been performed here. There were remnants scattered around it, bones, both animal and human, and tattered scraps of fabric that flapped gently in the breeze. It was as if this place had been abandoned in haste, the remains of some dark ritual left to rot in the damp air. My skin prickled with dread as I approached the altar, an overwhelming sense of malevolence radiating from the stone. And then I saw it, a small, leather-bound book lying at the base of the altar, half buried in the dirt. I reached down, hesitating for a moment before picking it up. The cover was worn, the leather cracked and faded, but as I opened it, I felt a surge of familiarity. It was the same handwriting as the journal on the ship, the same frantic scrawl that spoke of the Watchers and the curse of the island. I flipped through the pages, my pulse quickening as I read the final entries. The journal told of a ritual, a way to appease the Watchers and escape their grasp. But it was a dark, twisted process, one that required a sacrifice, a life given freely in exchange for freedom. A chill ran through me as I read the final line, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Only the willing may leave. The island demands a price. I dropped the journal, a cold sense of dread settling over me. The island wanted a sacrifice, a soul to satisfy its hunger, and if I couldn't find a way off, it would take mine. The pursuit. My hands shook as I backed away from the altar, the weight of the island's demand pressing down on me. I couldn't stay here. I had to keep moving, keep searching for a way out. But as I turned to leave the clearing, I heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. I turned, and there, at the edge of the clearing, I saw them, the Watchers, emerging from the shadows, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They moved in perfect unison, their heads tilting as if studying me, assessing my worth. I could feel their gaze piercing through me, stripping away my thoughts, my defenses, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. Carter. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but laced with an undeniable malice. It was as though the island itself were speaking through them, a single, unified voice that echoed in my mind. Stay with us, give yourself freely. I backed away, my heart pounding as I stumbled over the uneven ground. The Watchers advanced slowly, their movements unnaturally fluid, almost graceful. I knew I couldn't outrun them, not here, not in the dense forest where every step was a struggle. But I had to try. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tore through the underbrush. Branches clawed at my skin, the roots of ancient trees tripping me up as I stumbled through the forest. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. The whispers filled the air around me, growing louder, more insistent, as though the very trees were calling my name, urging me to stop, to surrender. The ground began to slope downward, and I realized with a jolt of horror that I was heading toward the cliffs. The ocean roared in the distance, its waves crashing against the rocks far below. Panic surged through me as I skidded to a halt at the edge of the cliff, my chest heaving as I looked down at the turbulent waters. The Watchers were close now, their figures emerging from the mist that hung over the trees. They moved slowly, deliberately, their eyes never leaving me. I was trapped, the cliff at my back, the Watchers closing in. There was nowhere to go, no way to escape. Carter. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Accept your fate, give yourself to us. The islands will press down on me, a force that was almost physical, urging me to take the final step. My mind spun, caught in the island's web, trapped by the promise of freedom that felt as hollow as the eyes of the Watchers. But then, as the figures closed in, something within me snapped. A surge of defiance flooded my veins, a fierce, stubborn determination that refused to bow to the island's will. I would not be another sacrifice, another lost soul bound to this cursed place. With a final, desperate burst of energy, I turned and sprinted along the edge of the cliff, my feet barely touching the ground as I raced away from the Watchers. Story 1. Island of Shadows. I woke on a desolate shore, choking on the sharp tang of salt and the weight of waterlogged sand clinging to my skin. My eyes cracked open to a dense mist, shrouding everything in a gray haze. I lay there confused, every inch of me aching as I pushed myself up gritty sand clinging to my palms. A shiver ran through me. The air was thick, cold, and still an oppressive silence that felt unnatural, as if something had swallowed the sound from the world. For a moment my mind was blank. I didn't know where I was or how I'd arrived here. The only certainty that drifted back to me was my name, Carter Blake. Nothing more. I couldn't remember how I'd ended up on this beach, what lay beyond the fog, or even what I'd been doing before waking up here. The feeling was disorienting, as though I were adrift on a sea of blank memories. I struggled to my feet, my limbs trembling as I took in my surroundings. The shoreline was narrow, a strip of coarse sand edged by steep, jagged cliffs that loomed overhead, dark and imposing. They rose like teeth from the land, their craggy edges lost in the mist. To one side, the waves beat relentlessly against the rocks, sending sprays of foam into the air, but the sound was strangely muted, as though the mist absorbed even the roar of the ocean. To my left, a dense forest stretched inland, a tangled mass of trees with trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches intertwined in an eerie embrace. Thick vines and moss clung to the bark, giving the forest a sinister, almost sentient quality. The trees were ancient, their towering forms shrouded in shadow. Each step I took toward them felt like a trespass, as though the forest were alive, watching, waiting. Instinct told me to move, to keep going though, to where I had no idea. Something primal urged me to leave the shoreline, to seek shelter from the biting cold and the strange, deathly stillness that seemed to envelop everything. I took a deep breath, calling out hello. My voice echoed back to me, a thin, wavering sound swallowed almost instantly by the mist. No answer came, only silence. A jolt of unease surged through me, quickening my pace as I ventured further down the beach. But there was nothing, no sign of life, no hint of civilization. Just the endless mist and the quiet, creeping dread that began to gnaw at my mind. I tried to reassure myself that it was merely disorientation, the shock of finding myself somewhere unknown. But a deeper part of me knew something was wrong, something far beyond simple confusion. The first clues. After a few hours of wandering, I stumbled upon the remnants of an old campsite, half buried in the sand. Tattered canvas flapped in the weak wind, the shredded remains of a tent barely standing. Scattered around it were the broken relics of what must have once possessions: a rusted kettle, a metal cup, an empty canteen, and something that made my heart race: a journal, its pages warped and stained but mostly intact. I picked it up, brushing off the dirt, and opened the cover. The ink was smeared in places, the writing faint, but I could still make out enough to read. The entries were fragmented, chaotic, a scrawl of words and half-finished thoughts. They are here. The Watchers. They see everything. Every step, every breath. The line cut off, ending in a dark blot of ink. I flipped through a few more pages, scanning the scribbled notes. Each entry was more frantic than the last, filled with disjointed phrases about rituals, the island's curse, and a haunting refrain that sent a chill through me: the Watchers are watching. I dropped the journal, feeling an irrational urge to flee from this place, to leave behind the eerie fragments of a stranger's desperation. But something held me in place, a strange fascination mixed with terror. I picked the journal back up, turning to the final entry, written in a hurried, slanted hand. I've seen them. They come at night, out of the mist, their faces blank, hollow. They know I'm here. They're waiting. The rest of the page was smeared, the words trailing off into an illegible mess. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were studying my every movement. I looked around, suddenly aware of the silence pressing in on all sides. The forest loomed behind me, dark and foreboding, while the sea stretched out in front, an endless expanse of gray waves. I was trapped, caught between land and sea with no idea how to escape. The whispers began. As the day wore on, I began to feel an odd sensation of prickling at the back of my neck, a cold tingle that crawled up my spine. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as nerves or fatigue, but the longer I stayed on the beach, the stronger it grew, until I couldn't ignore it. And then I heard it a whisper, faint and fleeting, as if carried on the wind. It was barely more than a breath, but it sounded unmistakably like my name. Carter. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there, only the mist swirling around me, thick and impenetrable. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, a hallucination born of exhaustion. But as I took a few steps forward, the whisper came again, clearer this time. Order. Carter. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something unsettling about it, something that felt wrong. It sounded close, too close, as if someone were standing just behind me, breathing the words into my ear. I forced myself to move, taking shaky steps down the beach, but the whisper followed, growing louder with each step. Carter, come. The voice was coaxing, insistent, pulling at something deep within me. I wanted to run, to flee from this invisible presence, but my legs felt heavy, my movements sluggish. It was as if the island itself were holding me in place, refusing to let me leave. As I stumbled forward, I caught a glimpse of something in the fog, a shadowy figure standing just at the edge of my vision. I stopped, squinting, but the figure vanished, leaving only the swirling mist. The island's secrets unveiled. Driven by a desperate need for answers, I ventured deeper into the island, leaving the shoreline behind. The forest closed in around me, its ancient trees towering above, their branches twisting and intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the weak sunlight. The air was colder here, filled with the faint scent of decay and something else, something metallic and sharp. As I moved through the dense undergrowth, I stumbled upon strange symbols carved into the trees. They were crude, jagged shapes, spirals and lines that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. I traced one of the symbols with my finger, feeling an odd sensation, a tingling warmth that spread through my hand. It was as if the island itself were alive, its secrets buried in these markings. I pressed on, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of the strange clues I'd found. The journal, the symbols, the whispers. It was all connected, tied to something dark and ancient, something that lurked within the heart of the island. And then I found it a cave hidden behind a curtain of vines, its entrance a dark gash in the earth. A sense of dread washed over me, but I forced myself forward, ducking under the vines and stepping into the cave's shadowy depths. The air inside was cold and damp, filled with the scent of earth and something else, something foul. As I moved deeper into the cave, my eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw them bones scattered across the ground, their white surfaces gleaming in the darkness. At the center of the cave was an altar, a slab of stone stained with dark, dried blood. Symbols were etched into its surface, the same strange markings I'd seen on the trees. And there, resting on the altar, was something that made my blood run cold, a necklace, its pendant shaped like an eye, staring unblinking into the darkness. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the pendant, and a vision flashed through my mind, a group of robed figures standing around the altar, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. They raised their hands, calling out to something, summoning it from the shadows. The vision faded, leaving me gasping for breath. I stumbled back, my mind reeling as the truth began to sink in. This island wasn't abandoned. It was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had come before me, drawn here by the same dark force that had lured me. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye, a shadow moving in the corner of the cave, a figure lurking just beyond the reach of the light. I froze, my heart pounding as the figure stepped forward, revealing a face blank and hollow, its eyes empty sockets that seemed to stare into my soul. The Watcher. I ran, fleeing from the cave. The figure's hollow gaze burned into my mind. As I burst out into the forest, the whispers returned, louder now, filling the air with a cacophony of voices that echoed my name, urging me to come back, to join them. The island wanted me, and it wasn't going to let me go. The Watcher's lair. I staggered back to the beach, barely able to breathe. Every step felt as if it took all my strength. My mind buzzed with fragments of visions, disjointed memories of the cave, of the altar, and the hollow, soulless eyes of the Watcher. The whispers followed me, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent, the voices intertwining like vines wrapping around my mind. As I reached the shoreline, I fell to my knees, digging my fingers into the wet sand, desperate for anything real, anything solid. The waves lapped gently at my feet, the cold sting a stark contrast to the feverish heat of terror that consumed me. I had to get off this island. The thought was simple, primal, and all-consuming. I didn't know where I was, how I'd arrived here, or even if I'd be able to escape. But the urge to flee was overpowering. In the dim light of dawn, something caught my eye, a small, ancient-looking boat partially hidden by rocks further down the shore. It looked barely seaworthy, but it was a chance, however slim. I hurried toward it, my pulse racing, the faintest glimmer of hope stirring within me. But as I approached, I felt the prickling sensation again, the undeniable feeling of being watched. I stopped, my body tense, and looked back. The mist hung low over the forest's edge, and from within it, I saw them. Figures, countless figures, moving slowly, methodically, their empty faces turned toward me. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, a ghostly light that seemed to pierce the fog. The Watchers had come out of the forest, and they were closing in, their movements unnaturally slow, yet somehow purposeful. Or harder. The voices overlapped, a chorus of whispers that chilled me to the core. Each one was different. Some sounded like children, others like elderly men or women, all twisted into a haunting harmony that echoed across the shore. With a strangled gasp, I turned and sprinted toward the boat. My footsteps thundered against the sand, but even as I ran, the whispers followed, the figures drifting closer, moving with a steady, implacable pace that defied the natural world. I reached the boat, my hands scrambling over the worn wood as I climbed in, frantically searching for oars. There was a single, half-rotten paddle tucked beneath the bench, and I seized it, pushing off from the shore. My arms ached as I began to row, the paddle dipping into the water with a sickening creak. I glanced over my shoulder, my heart plummeting as I saw the figures wading into the ocean, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The water barely seemed to slow them down. They moved as if it were merely an extension of the island, part of the cursed land that held them captive. The whispers grew louder, becoming a frantic chorus that filled my mind, drowning out my thoughts. I rowed harder, my muscles burning, each stroke feeling more labored than the last. Then, without warning, the mist thickened around me, swallowing the shoreline and the figures in an instant. I was adrift, surrounded by a dense, impenetrable fog that obscured everything. The world seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breaths and the relentless whispering that echoed from all sides. Order, come back. Join us. The whispers were no longer just words, they were thoughts, emotions clawing at my mind, pulling me back toward the island. The whispers followed me, filling the air with their insidious promises, but I ignored them, focusing only on the path ahead, on the faint glimmer of hope that kept me moving forward. The forest thinned as I ran, and I found myself back on the beach, the open expanse of sand stretching out before me. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, my heart pounding as I looked back toward the forest. The watchers had stopped at the edge of the trees, their hollow eyes watching me, their faces unreadable. For a moment we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Then slowly the figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist until there was nothing left but the empty forest. I fell to my knees on the sand, a wave of relief washing over me as the whispers finally faded, leaving only the sound of the ocean's gentle rhythm. The island had released me, for now, but I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. Exhausted, I lay back on the sand, staring up at the sky as the first stars began to appear. The island's grip was relentless, its hunger insatiable, and I was running out of time. But as I closed my eyes, the faintest spark of hope stirred within me. Somehow, some way, I would find a way to break the curse. I would escape this island, or I would die trying. A flicker of hope. The sky darkened, a deep indigo swallowing the last traces of sunlight. The stars seemed almost alive, flickering and shifting like watchful eyes in the heavens. As I lay on the sand, my body battered and bruised, I felt the weight of the island settle over me like a suffocating fog. It was as though the island itself was a living thing, its very essence intertwined with the soil and stone, reaching into my thoughts, my fears, my memories. I knew I couldn't stay on the beach forever. I needed to keep moving, to find shelter and supplies. But as I sat up and scanned the shore, something caught my eye, a faint glimmer in the sand, almost completely buried but reflecting the starlight. Curious, I crawled over and began brushing away the sand. My fingers brushed against cold, hard metal, and I pulled out an old-fashioned pocket watch. It was tarnished and rusted, its cover slightly cracked, but as I turned it over, I noticed an engraving on the back to CW, "May time favor you always." The initials didn't belong to me, but the watch felt strangely familiar, like a remnant of a past I couldn't quite recall. My fingers brushed over the delicate engraving, and for a moment, a flicker of memory surfaced myself as a boy, clutching a similar watch, feeling the weight of its significance even then. Was this watch mine? Or had it belonged to someone else stranded here long ago? A chill crept up my spine as I pocketed the watch, unwilling to dwell on the implications. Whoever CW was, I had the sinking feeling they hadn't made it off this island. The descent into madness. Over the next few days, or was it weeks, time began to blur. The island seemed to have its own rhythm, a twisted cycle of light and dark that bore no resemblance to the world I once knew. The sun barely broke through the dense fog, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. Nights felt endless, stretching on for what seemed like an eternity, filled with the hollow cries of distant creatures and the ominous rustling of leaves in the wind. I spent my days scavenging for food and water, carefully rationing the supplies I found among the abandoned camps. It became clear that others had been here before campfires reduced to ashes, discarded tin cans, bits of clothing tangled in the underbrush. Each discovery was like a ghostly reminder of those who had come before me, of lives lost to this cursed place. One day, as I was picking through the remnants of an old campsite, I found a journal half buried in the dirt, its pages yellowed and brittle. I opened it carefully, my hands shaking as I scanned the entries, written in a shaky, desperate hand. The watchers are always watching. I see them in the trees, in the shadows, in the corners of my mind. They whisper to me, calling me to the forest. I don't know how much longer I can resist. The journal was filled with similar entries, each one more frantic than the last. The final page was a scrawled mess of words, barely legible, but one line stood out, underlined and repeated over and over: "The island demands a soul." My hands trembled as I closed the journal, the words searing themselves into my mind. The island wasn't just haunted, it was hungry, and I was beginning to understand the truth. I wasn't just stranded here, I had been chosen, singled out to fulfill a twisted ritual, a sacrifice to appease whatever ancient force lay at the heart of this place. The Watchers. They weren't just specters or figments of my imagination. They were the island's keepers, bound to it, tasked with ensuring its hunger was sated, and I was their prey. The forest's call. I tried to keep to the shore after that, unwilling to venture back into the forest. But as the days passed, the island's pull grew stronger. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding with an inexplicable urge to walk into the trees, to surrender myself to the darkness. It was as though the island was calling to me, its whispers growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. One night, unable to resist any longer, I found myself standing at the edge of the forest, staring into the inky blackness between the trees. The whispers were louder than ever, filling my mind with promises of peace, of freedom. All I had to do was take a single step forward, to give myself over to the island's will. I took a deep breath, my hands clenched into fists as I fought against the compulsion. But the whispers only grew louder, wrapping around me like tendrils, urging me to surrender, to join the countless souls who had come before me. And then, from the depths of the forest, I saw them, the Watchers. They stood in a line, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, their faces expressionless but somehow filled with an insidious intent. They raised their hands, beckoning to me, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. I stumbled back, my mind racing as I turned and fled along the beach, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers faded as I put distance between myself and the forest, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the island tried to claim me again. It was patient, relentless, wearing down my will, my sanity, until I had no choice but to give in. The final revelation. Desperation gnawed at me as I roamed the island, searching for anything that could help me escape. I spent hours combing the shore, hoping for a piece of driftwood, a scrap of metal, anything I could use to build a raft or signal for help. But the island yielded nothing, its rocky shores barren and unyielding. And then, on a bleak, mist-shrouded morning, I stumbled upon a hidden cove I hadn't seen before. The entrance was partially obscured by rocks and vegetation, but as I pushed my way through, I found myself in a narrow passageway that led deeper into the island. The air was thick with a musty smell, a strange mixture of earth and decay, as though the very ground was rotting from within. My footsteps echoed as I made my way through the passage, the walls closing in around me, pressing down like the weight of the island's curse. At the end of the passage, I found a small chamber, dimly lit by cracks in the ceiling that allowed faint beams of light to filter through. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, covered in strange, twisted symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The walls were lined with bones arranged in patterns that defied all logic, as though they were part of some ancient, malevolent ritual. And there, at the base of the altar, lay a single, blood-stained knife. I didn't need to be told what it was for. The island's message was clear. If I wanted to leave, I would have to offer a sacrifice. The journal's final entry echoed in my mind, the words seared into my memory: the island demands a soul. But whose soul? My own? Or someone else's? A cold, hollow feeling settled in my chest as I realized the terrible choice before me. The island was willing to let me go if I paid its price. If I found another life to take, another soul to offer, I could break free of its grip, escape this nightmare. But there was no one else here. No one else to save me from this fate. The island had ensured that I was alone, its perfect prey, trapped and desperate, with no other option but to offer myself up to its hunger. The final act. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, a cold, brutal truth that shattered the last remnants of my sanity. I lifted the knife, my hand shaking as I brought it to my chest. The island's whispers filled my mind, urging me on, guiding me, promising release, peace, freedom. All I had to do was surrender, to give myself over completely. My vision blurred, tears streaming down my face as I pressed the blade against my skin. I could feel the island's hunger, its insatiable need for sacrifice, reaching out to claim me, to consume me. But even as I stood on the brink of oblivion, a tiny spark of defiance flickered within me. No, I wouldn't give the island the satisfaction of taking me. With a final, desperate surge of strength, I turned the blade outward, slashing at the twisted symbols on the altar, breaking the patterns, defacing the markings that bound the island's curse. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, a howl of rage and fury that shook the chamber, sending rocks and debris crashing to the ground. The island trembled, its malevolent energy dissipating, weakening as I destroyed its hold. The Watchers appeared, their faces twisted in agony, their forms flickering and fading as the curse unraveled around them. They reached out to me, their hollow eyes filled with a desperate, pleading light, but I turned away, refusing to be drawn into their nightmare. With the last of my strength, I stumbled out of the chamber, the weight of the island's curse finally lifting from my shoulders. The fog parted, revealing the ocean stretching out before me, calm and inviting, a path to freedom. I collapsed on the beach, my body exhausted, my mind numb. But as I lay there, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet stillness that I hadn't known in all my time on the island. The island had tried to claim me, to consume me, but I had broken free. And as the sun rose over the horizon, bathing the world in light, I knew that I had won. For now. As the sun rose, its light spread warmth across my battered, exhausted form. For the first time since I'd arrived, the island felt still. Its whispers had faded, leaving only the soft rush of waves along the shore. I closed my eyes, letting the sunlight touch my face, letting the salty breeze fill my lungs. I knew the island would always be with me, lingering like a scar on my soul, a place I could never truly escape. Its darkness had left its mark, a shadow that would forever remain in the corners of my mind. But I was alive. Somehow I had survived. With every ounce of strength, I pulled myself to my feet and walked along the beach, leaving behind the altar, the Watchers, and the countless souls claimed by the island's curse. As I rounded the bend, a miracle unfolded before my eyes. A boat on the horizon, its sails catching the morning light. I waved frantically, shouting until my voice was raw, willing them to see me, to bring me back to a world I feared I'd never see again. The boat drew nearer, and I could make out figures moving, responding to my desperate cries. Relief flooded through me, hot tears streaming down my face as they threw down a rope, lifting me from the hell I'd endured. As they pulled me aboard, I glanced back one last time. The island loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark against the rising sun, shrouded in fog, as if hiding from the daylight. And as I turned away, I felt it the faintest tug, a final whisper, promising it would be waiting, patient and eternal. The world seemed brighter, sharper as we sailed away, leaving the cursed shores far behind. The island's voice had dimmed to a memory, but I knew it would linger within me, a place not only hidden in the ocean, but also buried somewhere deep in my mind. I had escaped its grasp, but I knew, as surely as I was alive, that its shadows would always linger. The cursed carnival. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the small town of Elmbridge. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, and surprises were few and far between. Life moved slowly here, its rhythms dictated by seasons and routine. But that evening, something strange caught the eye of every resident. At the edge of town, where the woods began, a carnival had appeared. No one had seen it being set up. There were no trucks, no workers, and no signs of activity beforehand. One moment the field was empty, and the next it was filled with colorful tents, towering rides and garish lights. It was as though the carnival had materialized out of thin air, a bizarre spectacle that defied explanation. The carnival was called Le Cirque de Eclipse. Its entrance was marked by a large, ornate gate adorned with golden crescent moons and stars. Above it, a neon sign flickered in and out of life, struggling to stay lit in the growing darkness. The faint strains of carnival music, haunting and out of tune, drifted through the air, beckoning anyone who heard it to come closer. For the townsfolk of Elmbridge, it was irresistible. A carnival in town was an event too rare to ignore. Posters plastered on lampposts around town promised the most extraordinary experience and wonders beyond belief. 4 friends, each in their early 20s, found themselves drawn to the carnival like moths to a flame. There was Samantha, the pragmatic one of the group, always skeptical of anything too good to be true. She was a university student home for the summer, studying psychology. Then there was Elliot, a jokester, who had a way of making light of everything. He'd been friends with Samantha since grade school, and though his carefree attitude annoyed her at times, their bond was unshakable. Jonah, the athlete, was a local celebrity thanks to his prowess on the football field. His tall, muscular frame made him stand out, but beneath his tough exterior was someone who often second-guessed himself. Finally, there was Lily, a quiet girl with an air of mystery about her. She was artistic, introverted, and had an unshakable fascination with the macabre, always drawn to ghost stories and tales of the supernatural. The 4 friends had known each other since childhood, but their lives had begun to drift in different directions after high school. The carnival seemed like the perfect excuse to reconnect, to relive their carefree days before adulthood fully consumed them. "I can't believe no one saw them set this up," Jonah said as they walked toward the carnival gates, the towering Ferris wheel looming above them like a giant eye. "Yeah, that's what makes it cool," Elliot replied with a grin. "It's like it just appeared out of nowhere. It's probably some kind of pop-up event." Samantha frowned. "It doesn't make any sense. There's no way they could have set this up overnight. And why is no one talking about it? It's like it's just ... here." Lily, walking a little behind the group, was silent, her eyes fixed on the carnival ahead. She felt a strange pull toward it, as if the place were whispering to her, calling her closer. As they reached the gates, an attendant stood waiting, a tall, thin man in a dark red suit, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes were hidden behind round, reflective sunglasses, and his smile was unsettlingly wide. "Welcome to Le Cirque d'Eclipse," he said in a deep, raspy voice. "You're in for an unforgettable night." The friends exchanged glances, a shiver of unease passing between them. But Elliot, ever the one to break the tension, laughed. "Unforgettable, huh? We'll see about that." The attendant didn't respond to Elliot's quip. Instead, he handed them each a small black ticket with gold lettering. "Once you're inside, there's no turning back," he said, his grin never faltering. Samantha felt a cold chill run down her spine. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, but the attendant only continued to smile. "You'll see," he replied cryptically. Without further words, they stepped through the gates and into the carnival. The moment they crossed the threshold, a strange heaviness settled over them. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the vibrant lights and sounds of the carnival seemed distant, as if muffled by some unseen force. "This place is weird," Jonah muttered, looking around. The rides were operating, and there were people milling about, other visitors, families with children, and groups of teenagers. But something about them seemed off, almost like they were moving too slowly, or were somehow disconnected from their surroundings. The friends wandered deeper into the carnival, the bright lights casting long, twisted shadows. The air smelled of cotton candy and popcorn, but underneath it was something metallic, something wrong. The music that had seemed playful from a distance now had an eerie, discordant quality, like it was being played on an old, broken-down organ. "I don't like this," Samantha whispered, her eyes darting around. "Something feels wrong." "You're just paranoid," Elliot replied, though even he didn't sound convinced. "It's a carnival. It's supposed to be weird." They passed by a row of game stalls, each one offering prizes that looked oddly out of place: stuffed animals with too large eyes, dolls that looked far too lifelike, and masks that seemed to change expression when no one was looking. Lily stopped in front of a mirror maze. The sign above it read, "Enter if you dare face your true reflection." She felt drawn to it, an inexplicable urge to walk inside and see what lay within. "This looks interesting," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the entrance. "Looks creepy as hell to me," Jonah replied, frowning. "I say we skip it." But before anyone could decide, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman in a long, flowing black dress, her face pale and her eyes dark. She moved with an unnatural grace, almost gliding across the ground. She didn't speak, but her eyes locked onto Lily's, and she smiled a smile that sent a chill down Lily's spine. "Come, children," the woman said in a voice that was both soothing and sinister. "The night is young, and there are wonders to behold." The friends hesitated, but something about the woman's presence was compelling, as though they were being drawn into her web. Without thinking, they followed her deeper into the carnival, leaving the game stalls and the mirror maze behind. As they walked, the atmosphere grew even stranger. The people around them seemed less like carnival goers and more like ghosts. Their faces were blank, their movements stiff, like they were puppets on strings. "I don't like this," Samantha said again, her voice trembling. "I don't like this at all." But the woman in black continued to lead them, her smile never fading. She led them to a large circular tent at the center of the carnival, its striped fabric flapping in the breeze. The sign above the entrance read "The Hall of Mysteries." "Inside you will find the answers you seek," the woman said, gesturing toward the tent. What answers? Elliot asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. The woman's smile widened. All will be revealed ... in time. With that, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving the friends standing at the entrance to the tent, unsure of whether to proceed. "This is crazy," Jonah muttered. "We should leave." But the pull of the carnival was too strong. Despite their fear, despite the growing sense of dread that clung to them like a second skin, they stepped inside the tent. The moment they entered, the flap of the tent closed behind them with a heavy thud. They were plunged into darkness, the air around them thick and oppressive. I can't see anything," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Then, slowly, the lights flickered on, revealing the interior of the tent. It was vast, much larger than it had appeared from the outside. Strange symbols adorned the walls, and in the center of the room was a circular platform with a single ornate box sitting on top. "What the hell is this?" Jonah asked, his voice echoing in the empty space. Before anyone could answer, the box began to shake, and the air around them grew colder. A low, guttural growl echoed through the tent, sending shivers down their spines. And then the box opened. The box creaked open with an eerie slowness, revealing nothing inside but darkness. But the darkness seemed alive, like it was swallowing the light around it, pulling everything into its black void. The growl intensified, vibrating through the air, and the temperature in the tent dropped sharply. Samantha took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is that?" Elliot's voice was shaky now, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. Before anyone could answer, the shadows inside the box began to swirl, rising up like smoke. They twisted and writhed, forming a shape first indistinct and formless, then more defined. It was a figure, tall and looming, with eyes that glowed a sickly green. The thing, whatever it was, stood completely still for a moment, as if assessing its surroundings. Then it spoke. "Welcome," it rasped, its voice low and grating, like the sound of metal scraping against stone. "You have entered the Hall of Mysteries. Here, you will face the truth that lies within each of you." The friends stood frozen, their eyes wide with terror. The figure took a step toward them, its form flickering like a faulty projection. "What do you mean?" Jonah asked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it raised a hand, and the symbols on the walls began to glow with a dull, reddish light. The tent seemed to expand, the space warping and shifting, until it felt like they were standing in the middle of an endless void. The air was heavy with a strange, oppressive energy, pressing down on their chests and making it hard to breathe. "You have been chosen," the figure said, its voice echoing through the tent. "Chosen to face the trials that will reveal your true nature. There is no escape, only the path forward." Samantha's heart raced. She wanted to run, to get out of this nightmare and never look back, but her feet felt rooted to the ground, like the very air around them was holding her in place. "Trials?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. "What kind of trials?" The figure's eyes flickered, and a slow, menacing smile spread across its shadowy face. "You will see soon enough. But first ... a choice." With a wave of its hand, 4 doors appeared, materializing from the darkness. Each door was different, one painted a deep, blood red, another covered in strange, twisting vines, the third made of cold, black stone, and the last one shimmering like liquid silver. The friends stared at the doors, their minds racing with questions and fear. "You must each choose a door," the figure said. "What lies behind them will determine your fate." Choose wisely, for the wrong choice will seal your doom." Elliot laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing dread. "This is just part of the show, right? Some kind of escape room gimmick." But deep down, they all knew it wasn't. There was something far too real about this place: the cold, the darkness, the oppressive energy that seemed to pulse through the air. This wasn't just a game. Samantha swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What happens if we don't choose?" The figure's smile widened. "You have no choice. The game has already begun." Jonah took a step forward, his eyes scanning the doors. "This is crazy. There's no way any of this is real." But it was real. They could all feel it. Lily reached out toward the silver door, her hand trembling. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled back. "What do we do? How do we choose?" The figure's laughter echoed through the tent, deep and menacing. "The doors will show you the way, but beware, once you enter, there is no turning back." Without warning, the doors began to pulse with light red, green, blue, and gold, casting eerie reflections on the walls of the tent. Each pulse seemed to tug at something deep within them, as if the doors were calling to their very souls. Jonah clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. "We don't have a choice," he muttered. "We have to do this." Samantha's mind raced as she stared at the red door. Something about it called to her, like it was waiting for her to step through. But fear gripped her heart. What if it was a trap? What if choosing wrong meant death? Elliot walked toward the black stone door, his eyes narrowing in determination. "All right, fine. Let's get this over with." Lily was still hesitating in front of the silver door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. "I don't like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "None of this feels right." Jonas stood in front of the door, covered in vines, his muscles tense. "We're doing this together, right? No one goes through alone." The figure watched them in silence, its glowing eyes fixed on each of them as they made their choices. The air around them seemed to thrum with anticipation, like the very carnival was waiting for what would come next. Without another word, they each stepped forward, their hands gripping the door handles in front of them. The moment their fingers touched the cold metal, the doors swung open with a loud, creaking groan, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the rapid beating of their hearts, echoing in their ears. Then, one by one, they stepped through the doors, disappearing into the unknown. The moment they crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, and the tent was plunged into silence once more. Samantha found herself standing in complete darkness. The air was thick and heavy, almost suffocating. She could hear her own breathing, ragged and uneven, echoing in the confined space. Her mind raced with fear and confusion. Where were the others? What was going to happen? A dim light flickered to life, revealing a long, narrow corridor lined with mirrors. The reflections in the mirrors were distorted, twisted versions of herself, their eyes wide with terror. She took a hesitant step forward, the floor creaking beneath her feet. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" There was no answer. Only the sound of her own footsteps echoed back at her as she moved deeper into the corridor. The mirrors seemed to stretch on forever, reflecting back her every movement, every glance, every flicker of fear. Suddenly, one of the reflections in the mirror moved out of sync with her own movements. Samantha froze, her heart skipping a beat. She stared at the reflection, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection smiled at her. A chill ran down her spine and she stumbled backward, her mind racing. What was happening? How could the reflection move on its own? The reflection's smile grew wider, its eyes narrowing into slits. Then, without warning, it stepped out of the mirror. Samantha let out a gasp of terror as the reflection, her doppelganger, stood in front of her, its smile never faltering. The air around them grew colder, and the shadows in the corridor seemed to deepen. "You can't run," the reflection whispered, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "You can't escape." Samantha backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get out. She had to find the others. But the reflection was blocking her path, its eyes gleaming with malice. Samantha's breath hitched in her throat as the doppelganger took a slow step forward, mirroring her every movement but with an eerie, unnatural precision. The corridor seemed to close in around her, the walls shifting and warping as though they were alive, breathing with the same ominous rhythm as the figure standing in front of her. "You can't run," the doppelganger repeated, its voice like a twisted echo of her own. Each syllable dripped with malice, distorting into a hollow mockery of everything Samantha thought she knew about herself. The reflection's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and for a moment Samantha felt as if those eyes were pulling her in an inescapable gravity, tugging at the edges of her mind, whispering promises of safety, of release. She shook her head, breaking free of the trance, her heart pounding harder than ever. "This isn't real," she muttered to herself, trying to ground her thoughts in something logical. But nothing about this situation was logical. Everything about this carnival, this cursed place, had already defied reason. She turned away from the doppelganger, trying to find an escape route. But the corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, the mirrors on either side reflecting endless copies of her trapped between the nightmare version of herself. The other her didn't attack. It simply smiled, a knowing, patient smile that seemed to say, "I have all the time in the world." Samantha's pulse quickened. She knew that if she didn't find a way out soon, she would be trapped forever. Meanwhile, Jonah stood at the edge of a dense, dark forest. The door behind him had vanished, leaving him with no choice but to move forward. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the canopy overhead was so dense that it blocked out the moonlight. The only light came from a faint glow in the distance, a flickering flame that seemed to call him deeper into the woods. He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see the others, but he was alone. No sign of Samantha, Elliot, or Lily. His heart pounded in his chest, and every instinct told him to stay put, to wait for something to change. But the woods around him were growing darker by the second, the trees seeming to close in, their twisted branches reaching for him like skeletal hands. Reluctantly, Jonah took a step forward, then another. The ground beneath him was soft, squelching under his feet with each step, and the air grew colder the deeper he ventured into the forest. His breath came in short, panicked bursts as he walked, his senses on high alert for any sign of movement, any sound that might indicate danger. But the only noise was the steady rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant crackling of the flame. The flame grew brighter the closer he got, and soon he could make out a clearing up ahead. But something about it felt wrong, like he was walking straight into a trap. The moment he stepped into the clearing, the temperature dropped sharply. His breath fogged in front of him, and the flickering flame, which he now saw was a small fire burning in the center of the clearing, cast long, eerie shadows across the trees. At first, Jonah couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. The shapes around the fire weren't human. They were hunched, twisted figures, their limbs long and unnatural, and they were moving slowly, deliberately, in a rhythmic dance around the flames. Jonah's stomach lurched. He took a step back, but the ground behind him had shifted. The path he had come from was gone, The trees now formed an impenetrable barrier, hemming him in on all sides. As the figures continued their slow, ritualistic dance, one of them lifted its head, and for the first time Jonah saw its face, or rather the absence of one. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, there was only smooth, featureless skin. Yet somehow the creature was watching him, aware of his presence in the clearing. A cold sweat broke out across Jonah's skin. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself, but his feet were frozen in place, and all he could do was watch as the faceless figures circled the fire, their movements growing faster, more frantic. The fire roared to life, its flames now a deep, unnatural blue. The light from it illuminated the clearing, casting grotesque shadows across the figures' elongated limbs. Jonah's heart raced as he realized the figures weren't just dancing, they were beckoning him, urging him to join their macabre ritual. "No," Jonah whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "This isn't real. This can't be happening." But the figures continued their dance, their featureless faces turning toward him, as if they could sense his fear, his vulnerability. The flames grew higher, and the air around him crackled with energy, dark, malevolent energy that seemed to pulse in time with the creature's movements. Jonah's legs finally obeyed his brain's command to run. He turned, sprinting for the edge of the clearing, but no matter how fast he ran, the trees loomed closer, the branches stretching out to snatch him. He stumbled, his hands grazing the rough bark, and then he fell. The ground gave way beneath him, plunging him into darkness. Lily's pulse raced as she stood in front of an elaborate puzzle, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to fit the pieces together. The walls around her were closing in literally. Each wrong move, each misplaced piece caused the walls to shift inward, inching closer and closer to crushing her. The room she was in was small, claustrophobic, with no windows, and only a single dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow glow over the puzzle in front of her. The puzzle itself seemed simple enough at first, just a collection of strange symbols and shapes that needed to be arranged in a specific order. But every time she thought she had it figured out, the pieces would shift, the symbols rearranging themselves in a new, incomprehensible pattern. She could hear the faint sound of gears turning, metal grinding against metal, as the walls continued to close in. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the sweat trickling down her spine. She was running out of time. "Come on," she muttered under her breath, her fingers fumbling with the pieces. "Think, Lily, think." The symbols seemed to blur together, and her mind raced with panic. She had always been good at puzzles, but this one was different. This one was alive, shifting and changing in ways that defied logic. And the more she struggled, the more it felt like the room itself was mocking her, laughing at her futile attempts to solve it. With a final, desperate twist of the pieces, the puzzle clicked into place. The grinding of the gears stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then, the walls stopped moving. Lily let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, her entire body shaking with relief. She had done it. She had solved the puzzle. But as she looked around the room, she realized something was wrong. The walls had stopped, but they hadn't reset. They were still dangerously close, barely giving her enough space to move. And then she heard it. A faint whisper coming from behind her. Lily's heart skipped a beat, and she slowly turned around, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. There was no one there, no one visible, at least. But the whisper continued, growing louder, more insistent, as if the very walls themselves were speaking to her. "Lily." She froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was her own voice, distorted and twisted, echoing through the small room. Her pulse quickened as she backed away from the walls, her mind racing. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This can't be real." But the whisper continued, growing louder, more mocking. "Lily ... you can't escape." She stumbled backward, her back hitting the cold, hard wall. The light bulb above flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows across the room. The whisper turned into laughter, cruel, taunting laughter that echoed in her mind. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, and she clutched her head, trying to drown out the sound. "No," she muttered, her voice shaking. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." But the laughter continued, growing louder and more sinister with each passing second. The walls seemed to close in again, and Lily's breath came in short, panicked gasps. Just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the laughter stopped. The room was plunged into silence, the oppressive weight of the walls lifting. Lily's body shook with relief, but something still felt off, like she wasn't truly alone. Elliot's hands shook as he looked at the puzzle in front of him. His palms were slick with sweat, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He was good at this, at least. That's what he'd always told himself. He had a knack for these kinds of things, for seeing the patterns, understanding the logic. But right now, his mind was a blur, and the pieces on the board in front of him made no sense. The room he was in was dark, the only light coming from the strange, glowing runes etched into the walls. The puzzle was a set of mechanical gears and levers, all interconnected in a complex web of metal. It looked simple enough at first glance, but the more Elliot studied it, the more he realized it was anything but. He reached out to turn one of the gears, and the moment his hand touched the cold metal, a sharp jolt of pain shot through his arm, like an electric shock. He yanked his hand back, his heart pounding. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing at the puzzle. The shock had left a strange, tingling sensation in his fingertips, and the more he looked at the gears, the more he realized they were shifting on their own slowly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving. Elliot took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. He had to solve this, had to figure out what the hell was going on in this place. But every time he thought he had a solution, the gears would shift again, throwing off his calculations. He looked around the room, searching for some kind of clue, something he had missed. But there was nothing, just the cold, dark walls and the ever-present hum of the glowing runes. Time was running out. He could feel it. As the four ventured deeper into the bowels of the strange underground laboratory, an unsettling stillness clung to the air, thick and suffocating. Each step they took echoed faintly, a reminder of how isolated they were from the surface world above. The dim, flickering lights gave the impression that the power was unstable, threatening to plunge them into darkness at any moment. Old research equipment, some rusted and corroded, littered the edges of the rooms they passed through. Charts and documents scattered the floors, most of them indecipherable due to age and damage, yet the occasional diagram of a human form or mysterious symbols left their imaginations running wild. Samantha stopped suddenly, holding up a hand to signal the others. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. A faint humming sound, like the low thrum of machinery, reverberated through the walls. It seemed to be coming from farther ahead, beckoning them deeper into the labyrinth. Jonah tightened his grip on the flashlight, his knuckles turning white as he nodded toward the source of the sound. "It sounds like it's still operational," Elliot said, his voice tinged with both curiosity and apprehension. "Maybe there's someone else down here after all." "Lily," who had been unusually quiet for the last several minutes, stared at the ground ahead of her. Or something else, she muttered under her breath, her mind clearly drifting to darker possibilities. The strange occurrences they had already experienced in the previous rooms had shaken her nerves, but she wasn't about to back down. She wanted answers as much as the rest of them. As they advanced toward the noise, the architecture around them grew even more complex. The walls became sleek, polished steel, unlike the grimy stone and rusted metal from earlier. It felt as though they were transitioning into an area that had been maintained, or at least hidden from the decay, overtaking the rest of the structure. They rounded a corner and found themselves facing a large, heavy door, its surface polished but scratched, as if someone or something had clawed at it. Jonah stepped forward cautiously and examined the control panel beside the door. The display flickered weakly, but the symbols were unfamiliar. He sighed, frustration bubbling up. It's another locked door, but this one looks way more advanced than the others. It'll take time to figure out. Samantha, who had been the most composed of the group, glanced around the room. "We don't have time. That sound, it's getting louder. I don't think we want to find out what's causing it." As if on cue, the humming grew more intense, vibrating through their bones. The machinery within the walls seemed to be awakening, slowly but surely. Elliot scanned the room quickly and spotted a terminal on the opposite side. "Maybe that'll unlock it," he said, darting toward the console. The display blinked to life with a soft whir as Elliot tapped into the system. The screen displayed streams of code, interspersed with strange symbols, some of which looked disturbingly like the ones they'd seen on the documents littering the hallways. Elliot's fingers flew over the keyboard, but the codes were not easy to crack. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the pressure mounted, and he could feel the other's eyes on him. "Lily, help me out here," he called, hoping her expertise with cryptography would come in handy. Lily, though shaken, snapped into focus and joined him at the terminal. Together they worked through the algorithms and puzzles, finding patterns in the chaos. The tension in the air was palpable, with the noise behind the walls increasing with every passing second. Suddenly, with a satisfying beep, the terminal screen turned green, and the massive door in front of them creaked open. The heavy metal groaned as it slid aside, revealing an even darker, more ominous chamber beyond. What they saw inside made their stomachs churn. The room was large, filled with massive containment pods, each one connected to the walls by a network of wires and tubes. Inside the pods were humanoid shapes, their outlines obscured by the frosted glass, but the faint glow of the machinery illuminated parts of them: elongated limbs, distorted faces, and inhuman features. It was clear these weren't just ordinary humans. Whatever was in those pods had been altered in ways none of them could comprehend. Lily's hand flew to her mouth as she took in the horrific sight. What the hell were they doing down here? Jonah stepped closer to one of the pods, his curiosity outweighing his fear. These looked like they were experiments. Something went wrong, didn't it? Elliot's face was pale as he looked over the control panel attached to one of the pods. These experiments, they were trying to create something. Something. More than human, but it looks like they never finished. Samantha's eyes widened as she noticed one of the pods toward the back of the room. The glass was cracked and the wires had been torn away, leaving the machinery sparking faintly. Someone or something got out. The realization hit them like a ton of bricks. Whatever had been contained in this facility had escaped. It might still be out there, somewhere in the labyrinthine hallways they had just traversed. Or worse, it could be following them. "We need to leave." Now Samantha said firmly, her voice brooking no argument. But as they turned to leave, the door they had just come through slammed shut with a deafening clang. The lights flickered violently, plunging them into momentary darkness before dim emergency lighting bathed the room in a sickly red glow. The hum of the machinery intensified, and the pods began to vibrate as if something was trying to break free from within them. "Is it?" Waking up, Lily asked, her voice trembling. "We're not sticking around to find out," Elliot replied, rushing back to the terminal to try and override the door lock. His fingers raced across the keys, but this time, nothing happened. The terminal didn't respond. The situation was spiraling out of control. They were trapped in a room with failed experiments, something that had already escaped, and machinery that seemed to be turning against them. Samantha looked around, desperate for another way out. Then she saw a ventilation shaft at the top of the room, large enough for them to crawl through. "We can get out through there," she said, pointing to the vent. But it was high up, and they would need to stack some of the equipment to reach it. Jonah and Elliot quickly began moving crates and other debris to create a makeshift ladder, while Lily kept her eyes on the pods, half expecting one of the creatures inside to suddenly burst out. As they worked frantically, the hum from the walls grew louder, and the machinery seemed to be stirring to life. Something was happening, something they couldn't stop. The longer they stayed, the closer they came to whatever fate had befallen the previous inhabitants of this lab. "We have to move faster," Samantha urged, her heart pounding as the reality of their dire situation sank in. Elliot nodded, glancing nervously at the pods as they climbed up. The vibrations were growing stronger. Something dark was lurking, and they had no time to lose. "Understood. Let's continue the story, and I'll make sure to include more vivid and realistic details, building up the tension while increasing the amount of content generated." As Elliot reached the top of their makeshift ladder, he yanked at the grate covering the ventilation shaft. It was old, rusted, and held in place by several screws that had long since corroded. He pulled harder, his palms sweating from the exertion and fear of what might happen if they didn't escape in time. The metal groaned and bent under his grip before finally giving way with a loud screech that echoed through the dimly lit room. He tossed the grate to the side and turned to the others. "We're good to go," he said, motioning for them to climb up. Samantha was next, quickly pulling herself up with Elliot's help. The red emergency lighting bathed her face in a sinister glow, casting long shadows across her features. As she squeezed into the vent, the confined space felt suffocating, the cold metal brushing against her skin, sending a chill down her spine. There was barely enough room for her to crawl forward, and the stale air within the vent made it hard to breathe. Her heart raced as she moved, the metal creaking with each shift of her weight. Below, Jonah and Lily scrambled to follow. Lily's eyes kept darting toward the pods, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The fear was starting to take hold. Her rational mind, the one that had always sought to solve puzzles, was beginning to unravel. "Do you think they'll get out?" she whispered to Jonah as they climbed. Jonah cast a nervous glance at the pods. The figures inside remained eerily still, but the vibrations in the room were getting stronger, and the low hum had turned into an unsettling rumble. He didn't want to say it aloud, but he shared her fear. Whatever was happening, they had very little time. "Let's just focus on getting out of here," he replied, his voice taut with tension. The pods loomed in the periphery, their opaque glass distorting the figures within, making it impossible to discern whether they were still dormant or beginning to stir. As Jonah reached the top of the ladder and helped Lily up, the floor beneath them began to shake more violently. The hum turned into a deep, bone-rattling vibration that seemed to come from the very walls around them. The machinery lining the walls sparked erratically, and a horrible thought flashed through Jonah's mind. What if the whole facility was rigged to self-destruct? Lily clambered into the vent, her hands trembling as she pulled herself through the narrow opening. The confined space felt like a tomb, the walls pressing in on all sides, and the darkness ahead was suffocating. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she crawled forward, trying to keep her panic at bay. Jonah was the last to climb up, and just as he was about to pull himself into the vent, a loud crash erupted from behind him. He whipped his head around just in time to see one of the pods buckle, the glass shattering outward as something enormous slammed against it from within. A long, sinewy limb, unnaturally pale and twisted, emerged from the broken pod, its fingers clawing at the air as if searching for something to grab onto. "Jonah." Move Elliot's voice cut through the din, snapping him out of his trance. Jonah scrambled into the vent just as the creature began to pull itself free from the broken pod, its malformed body emerging into the room with sickening, jerky movements. The stench of decay and chemicals hit Jonah like a wave as he slid into the shaft, yanking the makeshift ladder behind him to block the vent entrance. They crawled as quickly as they could through the narrow passageway, the sounds of the creature's movements echoing faintly behind them. The metal walls of the vent felt like they were closing in, each creak and groan amplifying their fear. The ventilation system stretched on ahead of them, twisting and turning in unpredictable directions. It was hard to tell where it led, but anything was better than being trapped in that room with whatever was in the pod. Elliot led the way, his body pressed uncomfortably against the sides of the vent as he pushed forward. The dim emergency lights from the room they just left were quickly fading behind them, leaving the vent bathed in complete darkness. The only sounds were their shallow breathing and the faint, unsettling hum of the machinery still active below. "Do you think it's following us?" Lily asked, her voice barely audible as it echoed through the tight space. She couldn't help but imagine the creature crawling after them, its twisted limbs contorting to fit through the narrow ventilation system. "I don't want to think about it," Samantha replied from just ahead, her voice strained. "Let's just focus on getting out." The vent seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness disorienting as they crawled through the maze-like structure. Time seemed to blur, and it became impossible to tell how long they had been moving. The walls felt like they were closing in tighter with each inch they advanced, the air growing thinner and more stagnant. Each breath felt labored, the stale atmosphere doing little to calm their growing anxiety. Suddenly, Elliot came to a halt. He had reached a fork in the ventilation system, where the passageway split into two different directions. Both paths looked equally foreboding, the metal grates leading deeper into the labyrinth. "Which way?" he asked, his voice tense. Jonah caught up behind him, peering down both shafts. "No way to tell," he muttered, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "We'll just have to pick one." Lily, who was at the back of the group, felt her heart race as the pressure of their situation mounted. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, half expecting to see the creature crawling after them in the dark. Her imagination played tricks on her, conjuring images of its elongated limbs dragging through the vent, scraping against the metal, its hollow eyes glowing in the blackness. "We don't have time to second-guess," Samantha urged. "Just pick one." Elliot nodded and chose the right-hand path, hoping it wasn't a dead end. They continued crawling, the sharp corners of the vent digging into their hands and knees as they pushed forward. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Every muscle in their bodies screamed for rest, but they couldn't stop. Not now. Not with whatever was behind them, potentially lurking in the shadows. After what felt like an eternity, they reached another grate. Elliot peered through, seeing a small room below, dimly lit with a faint red glow from emergency lighting. It looked empty, but that didn't mean it was safe. "Looks clear," he whispered before kicking the grate open. One by one, they dropped down into the room, their legs shaky from the cramped crawl through the vents. The air in the room was slightly fresher than the stifling vent, but it was still thick with the scent of rust and decay. They took a moment to catch their breath, standing on edge, waiting for anything to jump out at them. The room was small, with walls lined with old, outdated computer terminals and stacks of paperwork. Most of the screens were shattered, but a few flickered weakly, displaying long-dead systems. It looked like an abandoned control room, but for what? Elliot stepped closer to one of the computers, trying to get a better look. The text on the screen was scrambled, but it was clear that this place had once controlled some part of the facility. "Do you think this was a lab or something else?" Lily asked, her voice still shaky. "It's more than just a lab," Samantha replied, scanning the room. "There's something darker going on here." Elliot reached out to touch one of the terminals, and as he did, a faint spark of electricity jolted through the screen. The monitor flickered to life for a brief moment, displaying a single word before dying out again: experimentation. A chill ran down their spines. "What kind of experimentation?" Jonah asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Before anyone could respond, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside the room. They all froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. Someone or something was out there. Elliot motioned for everyone to stay quiet. Slowly, he edged toward the door, peeking through the small, cracked window that offered a view into the hallway beyond. The corridor was bathed in the same eerie red light, but it appeared empty. Yet the footsteps continued, growing closer and louder. "We need to move," Samantha said, her voice urgent but quiet. Elliot nodded, signaling for the others to follow as they made their way to the door on the opposite side of the room. The tension was unbearable, every step they took feeling like it might be their last. With each passing second, the sound of the footsteps grew louder, more pronounced. Whatever was out there was getting closer, and they knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. The sound of footsteps grew closer and closer, filling the narrow hallway outside the control room. Each step echoed ominously, seeming to vibrate through the walls. Elliot stood with his hand on the door handle, heart racing, sweat gathering on his brow. His friends stood behind him, their faces pale and drawn in the dim red light. There was no other way out. This door was their only option. But beyond it, something was waiting. "Are you sure it's safe?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. She was shaking now, and Jonah put a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though his own fear was barely contained. "We don't have a choice," Elliot muttered, his voice barely audible. He tightened his grip on the door handle and slowly pushed it open. The metal hinges groaned loudly, sending a shiver through the group. He winced at the sound, but no one spoke. The hallway beyond was long and lined with doors, each one identical. The red emergency lights flickered intermittently, casting ominous shadows across the cracked, worn-out floor. It looked like something out of a nightmare. Samantha was the first to step forward, glancing back at the others with determined expression. "We keep moving. Stay quiet, stay alert. We can get out of here." They followed her lead, moving cautiously down the hallway. The walls felt oppressive, as though they were closing in on them with each passing moment. The distant sound of machinery hummed through the facility, giving the impression of something alive within the building. Each step they took felt like it echoed too loudly, like the very walls were listening to their every move. They reached the first door on the right. Elliot paused, glancing back at the group, but they all shook their heads. There was no point in opening it. They needed to move forward, not backward. The footsteps that had once echoed so loudly behind them seemed to have vanished, but that didn't make them feel any safer. If anything, The sudden silence was more terrifying. It was as if whatever had been following them was waiting, biding its time. "Something's off," Jonah murmured as they walked. "This place, it's not right." "We've known that since the beginning," Samantha shot back quietly. "But what choice do we have? We can't go back." Lily glanced over her shoulder for what felt like the 100th time. The oppressive stillness behind them made her more nervous than ever. It felt like eyes were watching from the dark, waiting for them to make a mistake, to slip up just once. She quickened her pace, moving closer to Jonah and Samantha. "Do you think it's still following us?" she asked, her voice a shaky whisper. "No idea," Jonah replied grimly. "But we can't stop. Not now." They reached the end of the hallway, where the passage split into 2 more corridors, each one identical. Elliot cursed under his breath. "We need a plan. We can't just wander around here forever." Samantha looked at both directions, her face tense with concentration. "There has to be a way out. We just have to think." Jonah scanned the walls, his brow furrowing as he studied the doors lining the corridors. Then he noticed something strange. One of the doors to their left had a symbol etched into it. It was faint, barely visible in the red light, but unmistakable. A circle with an arrow running through it. He pointed it out to the group. "That symbol. It's the same as the one on the puzzles." Elliot's eyes narrowed. "Do you think it's a clue?" "I don't know, but it's the only lead we've got," Jonah replied. Without waiting for a response, he approached the door and cautiously turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing another room beyond. This room was unlike the others. It was larger, with rows of metallic shelving units lining the walls, each one filled with strange, old-fashioned devices. At the far end of the room was a large table, and resting on it were several pieces of paper, meticulously laid out in neat rows. Elliot's eyes narrowed as he moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The papers weren't ordinary documents, they were diagrams, blueprints. "What the hell is this place?" Samantha muttered, staring at the shelves of bizarre equipment. Elliot scanned the blueprints, his eyes widening as he began to recognize some of the designs. They were blueprints of the very facility they were trapped in. But these weren't just maps, they detailed every room, every corridor. It looked like the place was designed as some sort of maze, and the eerie part was that it seemed to be constantly shifting. Lily joined him, her face pale as she looked over the diagrams. "This isn't a normal circus," she whispered. "It's alive." Jonah looked uneasy, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows. "What do you mean, alive?" Lily traced one of the blueprints with her finger. "Look, these rooms, they change. They move. This place isn't static." Samantha's breath hitched as she realized what Lily was saying. "You're saying this place is trapping us. It's adapting." Elliot crumpled one of the blueprints in his hand, frustration boiling over. "We've been running in circles this whole time. This place is designed to keep us in." Suddenly the lights flickered, plunging the room into near total darkness. The red emergency lights blinked rapidly, casting brief, unsettling glimpses of the shelves and the strange devices around them. A low, mechanical hum filled the air, growing louder by the second. "Something's happening," Jonah muttered, his voice filled with dread. Elliot stood up abruptly, his senses on high alert. "We need to move. Now." The group turned to leave the room, but the door slammed shut before they could reach it. They froze, staring at the door in horror. The hum intensified, vibrating through the walls and floor. It felt like the building itself was shifting, groaning under some unseen force. "What the hell is going on?" Lily cried, panic rising in her voice. Before anyone could answer, the shelves lining the room began to shake violently. One by one, the strange devices on them clattered to the floor, smashing into pieces. The machinery in the room started to malfunction, spewing sparks and emitting high-pitched whines. It was as though the entire room was collapsing in on itself. "Back away," Samantha shouted, grabbing Lily and pulling her toward the far wall. Jonah and Elliot followed, pressing themselves against the cold metal surface. The noise was deafening now, a cacophony of crashing, grinding, and whirring sounds. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The room fell eerily silent. The lights flickered back to life, casting long shadows across the wreckage that now littered the floor. Everything had returned to stillness, but the sense of danger was more palpable than ever. They were trapped, and whatever had caused the disturbance wasn't finished with them. "There's no way out," Jonah muttered, his voice filled with a grim finality. Elliot clenched his fists, his mind racing for a solution. "There has to be. We're not dying here." Samantha stared at the smashed equipment on the floor, her eyes narrowed in thought. "This place is a trap and experiment. Someone's watching us, controlling this." Lily shuddered, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they don't want us to escape?" Jonah's face twisted in frustration. "We're not playing their game. We're getting out, no matter what." Elliot's mind raced as he studied the wrecked room around them. The blueprints, the shifting rooms, it all pointed to one conclusion. They weren't just players in a game. They were test subjects in a twisted experiment. "We need to find the control room," Elliot said suddenly, his voice filled with newfound determination. "If this place is designed to trap us, there has to be a way to stop it." Samantha nodded in agreement. "Right, but how do we find it?" Lily looked at the blueprints scattered on the floor. "Maybe these can help, if we can figure out the layout." A sudden noise interrupted her. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoed from the hallway outside. "Someone's coming," Jonah whispered, his voice filled with dread. They all froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever or whatever was out there was approaching fast. Elliot motioned for everyone to stay quiet as they huddled against the wall. His mind raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. There was no time to think, no time to plan. They had to move. Now. The footsteps outside the door were growing closer, each one slow and deliberate. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as he pressed himself harder against the wall, willing himself to stay silent. The others followed suit, their breaths shallow and rapid, eyes darting nervously toward the door. The red light in the room flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls, making the silence even more unbearable. Just when it seemed like the footsteps would reach the door, they stopped. The group held their breath, waiting, but no one dared move. The silence stretched on, suffocating and tense. For a long moment, it seemed like whatever was outside was simply standing there waiting, listening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. First slow, then gradually fading away into the distance. Only when they were sure the danger had passed did anyone dare to move. "What the hell was that?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Jonah replied, his face pale, "but we need to keep moving before it comes back." Elliot scanned the room, his eyes falling once again on the scattered blueprints. He crouched down, sifting through the papers, hoping to find something useful. These plans. He muttered, "They're a map. The rooms shift, but there's a pattern. If we follow the right path, it should lead us to the control room." Samantha leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the blueprints. How can you tell? Everything looks random. It's not, Elliot insisted. Look here, he pointed to a series of arrows and numbers scrawled in the margins of one of the blueprints. These markers, they're clues. The rooms rotate in a specific order. If we time it right, we can get through without getting trapped. Jonah crouched next to him, skepticism in his eyes. And what happens if we're wrong? What if we end up walking right into another dead end? We don't have a choice, Samantha said firmly, standing up and adjusting her jacket. It's this, or we sit here and wait for whatever's hunting us to find us. Lily looked back toward the door, her expression filled with anxiety. I just want to get out of here. We will, Elliot said, trying to sound confident. He gathered the blueprints, folding them up and tucking them into his pocket. But we need to keep moving. The group gathered themselves, preparing to leave the safety of the room. The hallway outside felt even more oppressive now, knowing that something had been lurking just beyond the door. They moved in silence, keeping close together as they retraced their steps back to the fork in the hallway. Elliot studied the blueprint again, trying to make sense of the shifting layout. If I'm reading this right, he whispered, we need to take the left corridor and pass through 3 doors. Then we reach the 4th. The room should rotate again, and we'll find an elevator shaft leading to the control room. Should Jonah asked, raising an eyebrow. It's the best shot we've got, Elliot muttered, avoiding his friend's gaze. With no other options, they took the left corridor, their footsteps echoing softly in the empty space. The air felt heavier the deeper they went, as though the very building was pressing in on them. Every door they passed seemed identical, each one leading to some unknown part of the facility. The further they went, the more the walls seemed to narrow, and the oppressive red light gave everything an ominous glow. They reached the 3rd door. Elliot paused, his hand hovering over the handle. This is it, he said quietly, glancing back at the group. Let's hope you're right, Jonah replied, his voice tense. Elliot pushed the door open, revealing a room much like the others they had encountered, bare, metallic walls and a single dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. But something was different about this one. The air felt colder, and there was a faint humming noise coming from somewhere within the walls. They stepped inside cautiously, glancing around for any sign of danger. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the floor beneath their feet shifted. The walls began to move, groaning as the room rotated around them. Elliot grabbed onto the nearest wall, trying to steady himself as the room lurched violently. What the hell is happening? Lily shouted, her voice barely audible over the grinding of the machinery. We're in the rotation, Elliot yelled back. Just hold on. The room continued to spin, the walls shifting and grinding with mechanical precision. The red emergency lights flickered, casting chaotic shadows across the room as the space warped around them. It was disorienting, like being trapped in a never-ending spiral. Finally, with a jarring thud, the rotation stopped. The room settled into place, and everything went still once again. The door in front of them opened with a soft hiss, revealing a narrow hallway beyond. Elliot caught his breath, glancing at the others. We made it, he said, though his voice betrayed his exhaustion. Samantha was the first to step forward, peering into the hallway. Let's go, she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her posture. The hallway was narrow, the walls close on either side. It felt claustrophobic, as though the building was deliberately squeezing them into a smaller and smaller space. The floor was slick with moisture, and the air had a damp, metallic taste to it. Each step they took echoed unnervingly, and they could hear the faint whir of machinery somewhere far below. They pressed on, the hallway curving slightly as it led them deeper into the facility. Elliot kept one hand on the wall, his other clutching the blueprints as though they were a lifeline. He didn't know how much longer they could keep this up, the constant tension, the fear of what lay around every corner. Suddenly, the hallway opened up into a larger chamber, and there, at the far end, stood a massive steel door. It was unlike the others they had encountered. This one had thick metal rivets and a heavy locking mechanism. Above it, a small plaque read "Control Room." "We're here," Samantha said quietly, though there was little relief in her voice. Elliot approached the door cautiously, inspecting the locking mechanism. There was no obvious way to open it, no keyhole, no handle, just a solid sheet of metal. "How do we get in?" Lily asked, glancing around the room nervously. Elliot studied the door, frustration mounting. "There has to be some kind of access panel or..." Before he could finish, the door let out a loud mechanical click and the locking mechanism whirred to life. Slowly, the massive door began to slide open, revealing the room beyond. The control room was vast, filled with rows of computer terminals and large monitors displaying various sections of the facility. But what immediately caught their attention was the figure standing in the center of the room. It was a man, dressed in a lab coat, his back turned to them as he stared at one of the monitors. Elliot's heart skipped a beat. Who is that?" he whispered. The man turned slowly, and they could see his face for the first time. He looked tired, worn down, with dark circles under his eyes and a haunted expression. He didn't seem surprised to see them. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice hoarse. The group exchanged nervous glances. This man, whoever he was, seemed as trapped as they were, but his words sent a chill through the room, and Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that they had walked into something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. The tension in the room thickened as the man's words hung in the air. Elliot exchanged a glance with Samantha, who looked just as unsettled. Jonas stepped forward cautiously, narrowing his eyes at the figure in the lab coat. "Waiting for us." "What do you mean?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to the monitor, his fingers twitching as if resisting the urge to press some unseen button. The screens around him flickered with distorted images, maps of the facility, glimpses of rooms the group had already passed through and others they hadn't. One screen displayed a countdown timer, ominously ticking down, though no one could discern what it was counting down to. "You were chosen," the man finally said, his voice low and tired, as though he had repeated this same phrase countless times before, just like the others. Lily's eyes widened. Others, her voice cracked slightly, fear creeping into her words. What happened to them? The man turned to face them again, his expression bleak. They failed. A heavy silence followed. Jonas' fists clenched, his body tense. Failed? Failed? What? What the hell is going on here? The man seemed to waver for a moment, his gaze distant as if recalling some buried memory. This place. He began, gesturing vaguely to the room around them. It's not just a room. It's a test of survival, of endurance, of how far the human mind can be pushed. Each puzzle, each room, it's all designed to wear you down, to see if you'll break. Samantha stepped closer to the man, trying to piece together the fragments of his cryptic explanation. But why? Why are we here? Who's behind this? The man looked at her with hollow eyes. It's a game. For those who want to see how much pain and fear people can endure, the ones running this. They're not human, not anymore. They've transcended that. They thrive on chaos, on watching people suffer. The group stood frozen, the weight of his words settling in. Elliot's mind raced, trying to process the implications. This wasn't just about solving puzzles or getting out alive. There were people, or something far worse, watching them, orchestrating their every move. "So what about you?" Jonah asked, his voice taut with suspicion. "Are you one of them?" The man let out a bitter laugh. "No, I was like you, once lured here by promises of excitement, of a challenge. But I've been here so long I've forgotten how long. I'm stuck, just like you. They won't let me leave. They won't let anyone leave." Elliot stepped forward, his tone urgent. "Then help us. If you've been here this long, you must know how to beat this, how to get out." The man shook his head, his expression darkening. "There is no way out. The puzzles aren't meant to be solved. They're traps, every one of them. No matter how smart you are, no matter how strong you are, it's designed to break you." Lily's breathing grew rapid, panic rising in her chest. No, that can't be true. There has to be a way out. We can't be stuck here forever." The man looked at her with pity in his eyes. "I'm sorry, but the only escape is when they decide you've had enough." Elliot's hands trembled as he looked around the room. The control panels, the monitors, the countdown clock still ticking away, none of it made sense. None of it seemed real, and yet it was all too terrifyingly real. He glanced at Samantha, her face pale but determined, and then at Jonah, who was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "There has to be something we can do," Samantha said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. "If there's no way out, why would they bother with the puzzles? Why let us get this far?" The man's tired eyes flicked toward her, and for a moment there was a spark of something, hope, or maybe resignation. "They want to see how far you'll go," he said quietly. "How much you're willing to sacrifice to survive." Jonah slammed his fist against the wall in frustration, the sound reverberating through the sterile room. "Sacrifice? What the hell are you talking about? We're not giving them anything." The man didn't flinch. He simply watched as the countdown on the monitor ticked closer to 0. "That's what everyone says. But in the end, you'll do whatever it takes to get out. You'll give them what they want." The group stood in stunned silence, the weight of the man's words pressing down on them like a suffocating fog. Elliot's mind was a whirl of fear and confusion. Could they really be trapped here forever? Was there truly no way out? Samantha turned to the man, her eyes searching his face for any sign of hope. "If there's no way out," she said slowly, "then what's the point of all of this? What's the point of keeping us alive?" The man sighed, glancing once more at the monitors. "Because they want to see you break, and when you do, they'll decide whether you live or die." A cold chill ran down Elliot's spine. The others stood motionless, their faces pale with the realization of the horrifying truth. They had been led here like lambs to the slaughter, and now their every move was being watched, evaluated, and twisted into a sick game. The thought made Elliot's stomach churn. "We can't just give up," Jonah said through clenched teeth, pacing the room like a caged animal. "We have to keep going. There's always a way." Lily's voice wavered as she finally spoke. "But what if he's right? What if there's no way out?" Elliot's hands balled into fists at his sides. "We can't think like that. There's got to be something we haven't figured out yet. Something they didn't expect." The man's voice was barely above a whisper, but the words hit them like a hammer. "You can try, but in the end, they're always one step ahead." Just then, the countdown on the monitor reached 0. The room filled with a low, ominous hum as the lights flickered and dimmed. A new door, one they hadn't noticed before, slowly slid open, revealing a dark hallway that stretched out into the unknown. The man's face twisted in sorrow. It's time for the final test. The group exchanged nervous glances, their bodies tense and on edge. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the gaping black void before them. Whatever lay ahead, they had no choice but to face it. They couldn't turn back now. "We stick together," Samantha said firmly, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "No matter what happens, we stay together." Jonah nodded, his face grim with determination. "Let's get this over with." One by one, they stepped through the door, the cold air of the hallway wrapping around them like a shroud. Behind them, the door slid shut with a final, metallic click. The game was far from over. As they stepped into the dark hallway, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The walls, once sterile and clinical, now appeared to be constructed of rough stone, cold and damp to the touch. Flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting eerie shadows that danced menacingly across the floor. Each of them felt the weight of the moment. The air was thick with an unshakable sense of foreboding. Elliot took the lead, cautiously scanning the corridor for any signs of danger. "Stay close," he whispered, not wanting to break the silence but feeling an overwhelming need to assert some control over the situation. The others fell in line behind him, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone. As they moved further down the hallway, the oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of their breathing. Jonah glanced over his shoulder, peering into the darkness behind them. "Do you think they're watching us right now?" he muttered, his voice tinged with anxiety. "I don't know," Samantha replied, her eyes darting around as she tried to shake off the feeling of being observed. "But I wouldn't put it past them." Lily shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as they continued deeper into the hallway. The sensation of being hunted gnawed at her, and the fear of the unknown twisted her stomach into knots. "We need to find a way out of this place," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There has to be a way to stop this." Elliot nodded, though doubt crept into his mind. "We just have to stick together and stay alert. Whatever comes next, we can handle it." Suddenly, the lights flickered again, plunging them into darkness for a heartbeat before illuminating a large door at the end of the corridor. It was different from the others they had encountered, ornate and imposing, with intricate carvings that depicted scenes of torment and despair. The air around it seemed to vibrate with an almost palpable energy, drawing them closer, despite their instincts screaming to flee. "Do you think we should go through that door?" Jonah asked, apprehension evident in his voice. "It looks ominous." Samantha stepped forward, curiosity piqued despite her fear. "We've come this far. We can't turn back now." Elliot exchanged a glance with Jonah, who seemed torn between caution and the urge to keep moving forward. "Maybe we should check it out," he said finally, though his tone suggested uncertainty. As they approached the door, they noticed a series of symbols etched into the frame. They resembled some kind of ancient script, twisted and contorted in a way that made their skin crawl. Lily felt a shiver run down her spine, the ominous designs seeming to pulse with a life of their own. "Do you think it's another puzzle?" Jonah asked, squinting at the symbols. "Maybe we need to figure out what they mean." "Or maybe it's a warning," Samantha replied, her voice laced with trepidation. "Whatever's behind this door, it's not going to be easy." Elliot reached for the handle, his heart racing. "Let's find out." With a deep breath, he pulled the door open, the hinges creaking ominously as it swung wide. Inside was a dimly lit chamber filled with an array of strange contraptions and devices, each more sinister than the last. The walls were lined with monitors displaying distorted images and messages that flashed in and out like ghostly whispers. Is this some kind of control room? Lily wondered aloud, her eyes wide as she took in the chaotic scene. Strange machinery filled the space, with wires and tubes snaking along the floor. The entire room had an unsettling energy, as if it were a living entity. Jonah stepped inside, feeling drawn to a large console at the center of the room. "Look at this," he said, gesturing to a series of buttons and levers that pulsed with a faint light. "It's like a command center." Samantha followed closely behind, studying the screens that flickered with haunting images. One showed their own faces, twisted in fear and despair, while another displayed the countdown clock they had seen earlier. It was now ticking down from 10 minutes. "Why is it counting down?" Samantha asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What happens when it reaches 0? Elliot felt a sense of dread wash over him. "We need to figure this out. If we can stop the countdown, maybe we can regain control." As they moved closer to the console, a chilling realization dawned on them. The levers were labeled with cryptic phrases like "release, contain, and activate." Each term sent a jolt of fear through Elliot, as if they were playing with forces far beyond their understanding. "Maybe we need to pull one of these levers," Jonah suggested hesitantly. "It might stop the countdown." Lily shook her head. "Or it might trigger something worse. We can't just guess." Just then, the lights flickered violently, plunging them back into darkness for a fleeting moment. When the lights returned, they were no longer alone. Shadows danced at the edges of the room, flickering in and out of existence, as if they were materializing from the very air around them. Elliot felt his heart pound in his chest as he caught sight of distorted figures emerging from the shadows. They were grotesque and twisted, their features obscured by the dim light. It was as if the very essence of fear was manifesting before them, drawn to the chaos of the room. "Run," he shouted, his instincts kicking in as he grabbed Samantha's arm, pulling her toward the door. But as they turned to flee, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing them inside. The oppressive energy in the room intensified, the shadows closing in around them like a suffocating fog. "What do we do?" Jonah yelled, his voice rising in panic as the figures advanced. "We're trapped." Elliot's mind raced. "We need to activate one of the controls. It's our only chance." Lily's eyes darted between the shadows and the console. "Which one? We don't even know what they do." "Just pick one," Elliot urged, desperation fueling his words. "We have to do something." In a moment of sheer instinct, Jonah lunged toward the nearest lever, his hands trembling as he grasped it tightly. The countdown timer continued to tick ominously, and he felt the weight of their fate resting on his shoulders. "Here goes nothing," he shouted as he pulled the lever down. The room shuddered violently, the shadows momentarily retreating as the monitors blared to life. The screen showed an array of shifting numbers and symbols, and a voice echoed through the chamber, cold and hollow. "You have chosen. Release." The shadows howled in fury, the room swirling with chaos as the figures writhed and contorted in agony. Elliot and the others stumbled backward, their hearts racing as they watched the darkness surge around them. The monitors flickered wildly, displaying flashes of the room they had just left, twisting the reality around them. "What did we just do?" Samantha shouted, her voice barely cutting through the din. "Whatever it was, it's not good," Lily cried, panic rising in her chest as the shadows began to coalesce into a single, terrifying form. Elliot's mind raced, the realization hitting him like a cold wave. We have to find a way to stop this. We can't let it take us. But as the shadows began to take shape, a chilling laughter echoed through the room, wrapping around them like a shroud. It was a sound that sent ice through their veins, a promise of darkness and despair. The figures twisted and turned, a chaotic ballet of torment that threatened to engulf them all. Too late, the voice taunted, echoing off the walls. You chose your fate. Now embrace it. As the dark figures surged forward, Elliot felt the room tremble beneath their feet, the air thickening with the essence of fear. The countdown continued, each second a reminder of the inescapable fate they had unleashed upon themselves. They had unleashed something far more powerful than they could ever have imagined. "Hold on," Jonah shouted, grabbing the nearest control panel in a last-ditch effort to regain control. "We can fight this. We have to keep trying." With adrenaline pumping through their veins, they braced themselves for whatever horror awaited them next. In that moment, they knew they had to face the darkness together, or risk being consumed by it. The true test had begun, and there was no turning back. The darkness swirled around them, each heartbeat echoing with a heavy dread. The dark figure loomed larger, its features shifting and twisting into grotesque shapes, almost human yet profoundly wrong. Elliot could feel the palpable sense of terror emanating from the others, but he knew that they couldn't give in. They had to face whatever horror awaited them. "Focus," he shouted, trying to keep the panic at bay. "We need to work together. If we can keep our minds clear, we can find a way out of this." Samantha and Lily exchanged worried glances, but there was a flicker of determination in their eyes. Jonah, still clutching the control panel, looked up at Elliot. "What do we do? There has to be a way to reverse whatever we've done." Elliot scanned the chaotic scene before them, the monitors flashing erratic warnings that were impossible to comprehend. "We have to find a way to deactivate the release. Look for a reset button or something." As the figure lunged toward them, shadows erupted from its form, writhing like snakes in the dim light. The air thickened with the scent of decay, and a low growl reverberated through the chamber, echoing in their bones. Time felt distorted, the countdown clock still ticking down as if mocking their every move. With urgency coursing through his veins, Jonah raced to the other side of the console, frantically pressing buttons and flipping switches. Come on," he muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. "There has to be something here." Meanwhile, Elliot kept his eyes on the advancing shadow, its malicious intent growing clearer with every second. Samantha, Lily, help him. Look for anything that might indicate how to stop this. They dove into the chaos, the air electric with fear and determination. The shadows lunged, snapping like hungry jaws, but the group held firm, pushing through the disorientation. It felt as though they were fighting against the very fabric of reality, every instinct telling them to flee, while their minds screamed to stay and fight. Lily noticed a flicker on one of the monitors, a series of numbers rapidly decreasing, seemingly linked to their earlier actions. "The countdown," she shouted, pointing. "It's tied to the lever Jonah pulled." "Then we have to reverse it," Samantha exclaimed, her eyes wide with realization. "Jonah, try to find a way to reset the controls. We need to counteract what we did." Elliot felt a surge of hope, adrenaline pushing him forward. "We can't let it take us. We can't let it win." Jonah focused intently, his fingers racing across the console as he searched for a way to nullify their previous action. "There's got to be something here," he breathed, desperation creeping into his voice. "If we don't do this now, it's over." Suddenly, the dark figure halted, the shadows swirling around it like a storm. It emitted a low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the room. The monitors flashed a blinding white, and for a brief moment, all was still. Elliot could feel the weight of their fear pressing down on them, but he forced himself to breathe. Stay together, he urged, locking eyes with each of them in turn. No matter what happens, we can't lose each other. We fight, or we don't make it out. Jonah's hands trembled as he worked the console, the tension in the room mounting to a fever pitch. I think I found something. I'm initiating a reset. The room trembled again, the shadows recoiling as if repelled by an unseen force. Elliot could feel the air shifting, the oppressive weight beginning to lift, but the figure roared in anger, its form expanding in size, blocking out the dim light. "No," Samantha shouted, stepping forward defiantly. "You can't have us." With one final push, Jonah activated the reset, and a wave of energy surged through the room. The monitors flickered wildly, displaying a chaotic mixture of numbers and symbols, and the countdown clock reversed, beginning to count up instead of down. The figure writhed and shrieked, the shadows recoiling in response. Elliot felt a rush of exhilaration as the air around them pulsed with power. "It's working," he yelled, hope igniting in his chest. "Keep it going," Lily shouted, determination sparking in her eyes. "We can do this." As the shadows shrieked, the figure began to lose its shape, the dark tendrils unraveling like smoke dissipating into the air. They watched in awe as the twisted form unraveled, collapsing into itself until it was nothing more than a fleeting wisp of darkness. Jonah pressed the buttons with renewed fervor, sweat dripping down his face as the room shook violently. "Just a little longer," he urged, the determination in his voice cutting through the chaos. Suddenly, the oppressive energy in the room shattered, and a blinding light erupted from the monitors. Elliot shielded his eyes, feeling a force push against him. "Hold on," he shouted, gripping the console tightly. The shadows disintegrated into sparks of light, and as the last remnants of darkness faded, the monitors displayed a single, glowing message: "Reset complete." Elliot blinked as the air cleared, the room growing still around them. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by a fragile peace. The countdown clock had stopped, the numbers frozen in place. Breathing heavily, the four friends looked at one another, adrenaline coursing through their veins. They had faced the darkness and survived. But as they took a moment to gather themselves, an unsettling realization began to sink in. "What do we do now?" Jonah asked, his voice shaking as he turned to the others. "I don't know," Elliot replied, glancing around the now quiet room. "But whatever happens, we stick together. We have to find a way out of this place." Suddenly, the door they had entered through creaked open, revealing the darkened hallway beyond. A sense of cautious hope filled the air. They exchanged determined glances and stepped forward as one, ready to confront whatever lay ahead. But as they moved through the doorway, a sense of unease lingered. They had escaped the immediate danger, but the memory of the shadows haunted them. Had they truly defeated the darkness, or had they merely delayed it? With each step down the corridor, the feeling of being watched returned, a chill crawling down their spines. They could hear echoes of whispers in the air, taunting them, a lingering reminder that the horrors of the room were far from over. The group pressed on, their hearts racing, knowing that they still had a long way to go. As they approached the next challenge, the line between reality and illusion blurred once more, and they braced themselves for what awaited them beyond the threshold. As the darkness surged around them, the four friends felt the shadows pressing in, their whispers transforming into a deafening roar. Panic threatened to engulf them, but Elliot stood firm, the flicker of determination igniting in his chest. "We have to remember what we faced. were stronger together. With their hands still clasped, they formed a circle, focusing on the bond they had forged through their shared trials. The whispers grew louder, mocking their unity, but their resolve hardened. They began to chant, drawing upon the strength of their friendship. "We will not be afraid. We will not be trapped." Suddenly the air crackled with energy, and the shadows recoiled as if repelled by their words. The light around them intensified, piercing through the encroaching darkness. In that moment, each friend felt a surge of power radiating from their hands, illuminating the space and pushing back against the gloom. The swirling shadows shrieked in frustration, the cacophony growing chaotic as the friends poured their hearts into their chant. "Together we are free. Together we will fight." Their voices harmonized, becoming a singular force that filled the room, drowning out the sinister whispers. In a blinding flash, the darkness shattered, breaking apart like glass. The remnants of the shadowy tendrils dispersed into the ether, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The friends stood in the brilliant light, breathless but unbroken, their hearts pounding with adrenaline and triumph. As the echoes of the room faded, they found themselves standing in a sunlit space, the air fresh and invigorating. The room had transformed into a vibrant landscape, a world free from the clutches of fear and despair. Lush greenery surrounded them, and the sounds of laughter and joy filled the air. "We did it," Samantha exclaimed, her face alight with relief. "We're free." Lily looked around astonished. "Is this real?" Jonah nodded, tears of joy streaming down his cheeks. "We made it. We're really free." Elliot gazed at his friends, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Together we can conquer anything. This experience has only made us stronger." They embraced one another, feeling the warmth of their friendship wash over them. As they stood there, the realization sank in that they had not just escaped a physical trap, but had also faced their innermost fears and emerged victorious. A path stretched out before them, leading toward the horizon, where the sun dipped below the landscape, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. Together they walked forward, leaving behind the darkness of the circus, hand in hand, ready to face whatever lay ahead in their lives. As they stepped into the fading light, laughter echoed around them, the shadows of their past replaced by the warmth of hope and friendship. The experience had tested them, but in the end, it had brought them closer than ever. They were not just survivors, they were warriors of light, ready to embrace the future, no matter what challenges awaited them. As we reach the end of tonight's stories on Hauntales, it's time to let your mind drift away. Listen to the sound of the rain gently falling in the background. Let each drop calm your thoughts and ease you into a peaceful sleep. There's nothing to fear now, just the soothing rhythm of the rain. Focus on your breathing, let your body relax, and allow yourself to drift deeper into rest. Sleep peacefully, and we'll meet again tomorrow night for another story. Good night.